Good afternoon, everyone. What a great, sort of event that we're having here today. It's so wonderful to see all of you join us. I'm Tina Chen. I'm the Vice Provost Equity and also a Distinguished Professor in the Department of History. And I've had the good fortune to be involved in the Tony T.K. Lau Lecture in Contemporary China since its beginning days. And so I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here today. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Inunuiq, Anisi-Inunuiq, Dakota Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And as I think today, as we get ready for the lecture, and I think about this acknowledgement, it makes me think about the importance of relationships. The types of relationships that we build amongst ourselves, with other people, with countries and other institutions. And I suspect that's going to be a bit of a theme of what Dr. Bowles will be talking about, as well as the way we think across generations and over the longue durée about what those mean to us and how we bring legacies forward and what we need to do to build better relationships with all peoples. As we get started today, I want to welcome all of you. I'm really thrilled to see this theater nice and full. I would also like to, you'll meet many of our guests who will speak and bring greetings on behalf of the university and other people involved in the talk, but I would also like to welcome and acknowledge that we have joining us today Jennifer Chen, the MLA for Fort Richmond. Jennifer, stand up and give us a wave. Jennifer is the first Chinese Canadian elected to the Manitoba legislature, and someone with whom those in the community, including myself and the Chinese community, work very closely, and is an alum of the University of Manitoba from the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. I would also just like to let you know that we are both there's a video recording and a recording of today's, and photos being taken. So if you do not want to be in any photos or any recording, please just, discreetly put your hand up. Our staff will be looking for that and they'll ensure that you're not included in any photos. And if you have any concerns about those, you can feel free to reach out to myself or to Amber over here, just to make sure that if you don't wish to be included in any recordings, that we respect your wishes. And so that is all in my role here in the initial greetings that they've given me. And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mario Pinto, the Vice President, Research and International, who will be bringing greetings on behalf of the university. Mario.
Thanks very much, Tina. It's great to see all of you here and to welcome you to the University of Manitoba. For those of you joining us coming home, welcome home. This is the third installment of the Tony T.K. Lau Lecture on Contemporary China. The lecture series is named for Tony T.K. Lau, the current president and founding member of the Chinese Alumni Association of Canada, based in British Columbia. We're very grateful to Mr. Lau for establishing today's lectureship in their honor. And we're very fortunate that Mr. Lau has joined us here today. So welcome, sir. Our community's gratitude also extends to the opportunities provided to current students through the Tony T.K. Lau Scholarship and Bursary. The award recognizes international students who help other international students adapt to Canada and university life. The spirit of this award is one of community building. And on behalf of our city, province, and country, I thank Tony for such an inspiring, thoughtful, and meaningful gift. Thank you, Tony, also for all you have done for our students, alumni, and faculty. I am pleased to now turn my attention to welcome today's guest speaker, Dr. Paul Bowles. A professor emeritus at the University of Northern British Columbia, Dr. Bowles has held positions in the Department of Global and International Studies and the School of Economics for over 30 years. He has recently become Professor Emeritus at 11:59 p.m. on December of 2023, and he has wimped out and now lives in Nanaimo, BC. He has served on the editorial boards on the journals Review of International Political Economy and Pacific Affairs. And recently, he held a visiting position as a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2022. Dr. Bowles has visited China regularly since 1987, and he's widely published on subjects of labor systems, rural enterprises, and global value chains. His recent research investigates how China manages its currency and the implications of internationalization on future monetary systems. A better understanding of this global economic context provides us an opportunity in our collective efforts to inspire social change through research, very much part of our new strategic research plan for the University of Manitoba. Thank you all for joining us, and please enjoy the presentations, and welcome to both our honored guests and our MLA. So thank you.
I'm not Paul Bowles. Thank you, Vice President Pinto, for joining us today. Homecoming week is an extremely busy time for the President's Office team, and we appreciate that you've taken the time to be with us today for this special event. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, I'd like to welcome each of you to this distinguished annual homecoming event. It's lovely to see an audience that includes a mixture of students, alumni, faculty, and also our former Dean, Jeff Taylor, is here with us, and a personal friend of Tony Lau's. I also want to welcome members of the greater Winnipeg community who are here because of Tony's vision to bring us together to learn more about contemporary issues related to China. Through our visiting speakers in this series, we can learn more than what we see on the news or social media. Gathering together in scholarship advances our overall understanding. It can also be helpful as some of us may study China, work in China, or work with colleagues or companies based in China in the future. We are most grateful to all of you for attending this special event. Homecoming is a special time when we can invite back our alumni to reminisce about the past as well as celebrate the accomplishments that you've all attained since leaving the university. This afternoon, we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Bowles, who joins us through the generosity of Mr. Tony Lau. Tony is a longtime friend of the Faculty of Arts. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree with us back in 1971 and moved on to the University of Toronto to complete a Master of Arts degree. In 1981, he founded Tony Lau Insurance Agencies Limited in British Columbia, where he continues today as president and CEO. Tony's connection with the University of Manitoba remains strong and led him, along with a small group of others, to found the University of Manitoba Chinese Alumni Association of Canada. As Dr. Pinto mentioned, Tony is also a donor, having established this lectureship along with a scholarship, bursary, and academic prize. Tony, we are grateful and thankful for your generosity, your dedication to helping students, and your commitment to help further all of our understanding of the role China plays in our world. The Tony T.K. Lau Lecture on Contemporary China brings distinguished individuals to the University of Manitoba to speak about issues such as trade wars, the economy, human rights crises, social problems, environmental challenges, and other timely topics. In 2022, we welcomed Dr. Gregory Chin from York University, who spoke on the trade war between the US and China and how this impacts Canada and the world. And last year, Dr. Pascal Massot from the University of Ottawa recommended that we carefully study the government of China's past behavior to help us better understand their future behaviors. Today, I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Bowles' take on China's uncharted transitions. As you listen today, I encourage each of you to consider questions for Dr. Bowles. Let's take advantage of having him here, sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. There will be a Q&A afterwards where we can keep the discussion going, and then this will be followed by a reception in the lobby of the theater. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoy today's event. And now I turn things over to Mr. Lau to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Dr. Pinto, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome everyone to the annual lecture on contemporary China. It is so wonderful to be back on campus. And many, many years ago, I first saw and touched snow here on campus. So as a foreign student from Hong Kong, first time leaving my hometown, I went through tremendous kind of cultural shock. In winter, I had to find my way through the tunnels. An alien concept for a youngster from Hong Kong. I was homesick. So fortunately, my first winter, first Christmas, through the ISO, International Student Organization, I was invited by a Canadian family to spend on my first Christmas in Russell, if you know about this small town, Russell, many miles away. And then there, I had a good time. I rode on a snowmobile with a lot of little kids on a frozen lake, and the snowmobile, they call it skidoo, but same, right? Yeah. And I had a good time with dogs chasing us. Wow, that was quite an experience. That was my first white Christmas. So at that time, while I was on a very tight budget, at that time, international students could apply for work permit only during summer months. So I had no choice but to wait and accepted my fate as gainfully unemployed. And during the 8 months a year, I studied, I played table tennis, I had good time, spending time meeting friends. In my first summer, I was lucky. I found a job working on a brand new, well-built, recently built ship along Lake Winnipeg called MS Lord Selkirk, sailing from Selkirk. This cruise ship. I worked there as a waiter the first summer. It was considered a good job. Then the following summer, I returned, and then I was lucky to be promoted to maitre d', and because I broke so many dishes. They say, don't touch dishes, so you do something else. So I just happened that the Queen of England and her family visited the ship, spent some time there. So in the special room, the private room, they stay as maitre d'. I oversaw, I supervised the food and beverages, and I took the opportunity to take a picture with the Queen and her family. And later on in my career in Vancouver, I often joke to my family and friends, if I can't make it in my job, my career, I will open a restaurant declaring my food and services are good for a queen. Check out the photo. So that was my last resort. But I didn't actually get to take that resort. So it worked out well in my years on campus. I met lifelong friends. I think some of them are here. Is David Rosner here? I can't see because it's dark. Is David Rosner here? He's supposed to be here. My friend for half a century. And then there's my former professor, Dr. Henry Heller from University College. He used to teach me. And here, thank you for coming, Dr. Heller. You can see my connection back half a century, and it actually brings back fond memories of my time on campus. Now, I think you want not to hear me, to listen to the lecture. So I'd like to take time here to introduce our lecturer, keynote speaker. Dr. Paul Bose is Professor Emeritus at the University of Northern British Columbia. He did graduate work at the University of Sussex and the London School of Economics. For the past 30 years, he has been at the University of Northern British Columbia, where he held positions in the Department of Global and International Studies and the School of Economics, as well as holding a number of visiting positions, most recently as a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2022. Nice job, warm there. He has visited China regularly since 1987. He has published widely on China, including on the political economy of financial reform, labor systems, rural enterprises, privatization, renminbi internationalization, and global value chains. He has also published on Asian regionalism and global political economy. His research has appeared in leading academic journals as well as in print media and in presentations to government. He has served on the editorial boards on journals such as Review of International Political Economy and Pacific Affairs, as well as an editor for the Critical Development Studies book series with Routledge. Very long, but I hope you enjoy his talk. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Bose. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Tony, for your kind introduction and for your support for this type of public event, which plays an important role in the life of a university and its community. It is an honour to be here, and I hope that I can live up to the aims of the lecture series. Luckily, I'm told you're only invited once, so if I don't, well... My thanks also for the territorial acknowledgement and to the Faculty of Arts and for the university for the opportunity to be with you today. When I wrote that, I did use the word opportunity, but I thought, well, I'm not sure. It really should be challenged, shouldn't it? Because I don't know the audience. So some of you may be old China scholars. Some of you may just have a passing interest. So I hope that my remarks today will be of broad enough interest for everyone. As Heidi indicated in her opening remarks, hardly a day goes by without China being in the news. Currently, the tariffs on Chinese EVs, electric vehicles entering the North American and European markets, have received much attention, as has China's threatened retaliation against Canadian canola exports, a particular concern for this part of the country. Not so long ago, the plights of the so-called two Michaels and the arrest of Meng Wanzhou were the headlines. It's easy to become gripped by the headlines and caught up in the immediacy of events and reactions to them. But to understand contemporary China and current disputes, I want to suggest to you that it's necessary to take a slightly longer view. And I'm aware that I'm in the presence of historians, so what I think is quite long probably is quite short by their views. My argument is that China is undergoing major transitions which are momentous in scale, without clear paths, and interact complexly with each other. How they evolve has large implications for China and for the rest of the world. What we see in the headlines every day is the froth on top of the swirling, ebbing and flowing waves beneath. And in my short talk today, I want to try and look through the froth to see the waves. In doing so, I need to decide which concepts are most useful to use. I will suggest to you that the concept of transitions is useful for understanding what is going on in China today, why some tensions have arisen with other countries, and transitions should be taken into account in medium-term policy analyses. The concept of transitions is as relevant for Canada as it is for China, and even though I will concentrate here on the latter, I will make some links between them towards the end of my remarks. So let me see if I can convince you, in the short time I have available, that analysing transitions provides important insights and can help us see the waves more clearly. Transitions are evident at various levels. Much attention has been paid to the transition to multipolarity at the global level, a transition driven to a significant degree by accounts of China's rise. I will focus here, though, on China's domestic transitions. There are three in particular that I want to talk about. These are the development, the systemic, and the green transitions. Before I say more about each, I should also immediately point out that these are not the only transitions China is experiencing. There is also the demographic transition, as China's population ages, which has major consequences too. As a further transition, which is notable by its absence, namely a transition in the political system, widely known in China as the fifth modernization in the early reform years, but less talked about now. With this caveat, let me outline each of the three transitions on which I will focus in the rest of this lecture. The first is what I've termed the development transition. The term development is, of course, a contested one. The origins of the term are usually tied with post-1945 versions of linear capitalist development paths, and this has been rightly criticised as a result, with post-development writers leading the assault. The term development is also typically interpreted economistically, especially by the international financial institutions, and so other concepts such as human development and its associated indices have also emerged and become popular. But without going into these wide-ranging debates, I want to make the case that the term development, in its limited economistic sense, is still relevant for understanding contemporary China, not least because it's the way in which the Chinese authorities understand it and act upon it. The current 14th five-year plan, with its talk of the goal of socialist modernization, can be interpreted in this way. In this sense, the development transition is about structural change in the economy, a view which was common in the development literature of the 1960s and which is still alive and well in Chinese planning circles today. It involves the process of first moving an economy from one in which the main proportion of national income, although not necessarily of the workforce, comes from industry rather than agriculture. This is a transition which has been underway in China since 1949 and which accelerated in the post-1978 reform period, facilitated in part by the more than 200 million migrant workers moving into the new export-oriented industries, which were first established in the coastal towns and cities, but have been more widely dispersed since. It is this transition which has fueled China's remarkable growth and catapulted it into being one of the world's largest economies and exporters. There have been twists and turns, with the leadership stressing the quality rather than the quantity of growth at various times, but essentially this has been a growth-oriented strategy designed to lift China into the ranks of middle-income countries by 2035. Poverty rates have fallen substantially, but income inequality has widened dramatically. Gender segmentation and discrimination is widespread, as is the suppression of independent labour rights. Safety nets have been weakened or worse along the way. All factors that we would want to include in any broad assessment of development. But in terms of the basic economic objectives which China's leaders set themselves, the development transition has been remarkable. Rising per capita income, increased consumption, new job creation, the expansion of the service sector, and the growth of the middle class are all indicators of this. China is an export powerhouse and the world's factory. This is the story of the 1980s to the first decade of the 2000s. The next stage, according to China's leaders, is to shift the structure of the economy further to more high-tech industry and services and a more sustainable economy. High-quality development, as official documents call it, in an effort to continue economic growth and increase national income and GDP per capita. I will return to the international implications of this later. But it should be remembered in this context that China's development transition has still a long way to go. We still live in a two-tier hierarchical global economy in which a relatively small proportion of the world's inhabitants and a small number of rich countries consume a disproportionate share of the world's resources, and only a few countries have been able to break into this select group. Even those that have reached middle income status, as China aspires to do, have often faced a so-called middle income trap, unable to close the gap further. The point of this is that this is the way the Chinese leadership thinks. The development transition means continually closing the per capita income gap with the rich countries as a or the world leader in key new segments of the future economy. And it still has a long way to go. Notwithstanding China's remarkable growth and rise in living standards over the past 4 decades and more, depending on which measure you use, which methodology you use, per capita GDP today is between 2.5 and 4 times higher in Canada than it is in China. And it's between 3.5 and 6.5 times higher in the US than it is in China. So the scale is roughly an American citizen, taking the average of those numbers, has something like 5 times the material standard of living of a Chinese citizen. And that's the gap that Chinese policymakers are focused on when they talk about the development transition. It's true that these gaps have been rapidly closing, but there is still a long way to go, and China considers its development transition far from complete. The second transition is the systemic transition. By this I mean the transition from the planned economy of the Mao period to the more market-based economy of the present. How far China has gone and how far it should go in this direction remain topics of debate within China and of interpretation by scholars outside. At the outset of the reform period, the market was theorized as being in a bird cage, with state policies providing the rigid cage within which the market bird would fly. As market competition was introduced and expanded, and mass privatization occurred, especially for small and medium enterprises, many argued that the bird had flown the coop and that China had transitioned to capitalism. The role of the market is still a subject to differing assessments, with the WTO, for example, unwilling yet to classify China as a market economy, given its high levels of state intervention. But as I hinted, the systemic transition is about more than simply the market, but also bound up with the ownership system and the role of profits as the driver of production, i.e., about a transition to capitalism. There are those that argue that the collective ownership of rural land and the continuing prominence of state ownership of large enterprises means that China has not made a full transition, but still operates some kind of socialist system. Indeed, the Chinese leadership's claim is it is overseeing socialism with Chinese characteristics. To others, the majority of outside observers, I would say, this is wordplay, and China is best classified as a capitalist economy. This implicitly implies analysing China in class terms, a contested process for sure. But as evidence, we can point to the existence of China's billionaires, the wealth enjoyed by the party and state officials, as well as the managers of large enterprises, both private and public. With a different set of interests and different work relations are the working classes, both old and new, including the army of first and second generation migrant workers, whose struggles have been documented by a number of scholars. So if we look at ownership forms and new property relations, one could conclude that China has made a systemic transition to capitalism. But even if you did reach that conclusion, it is left to further decide what type of capitalism. Capitalism comes in many varieties, and accurately capturing the nature of Chinese capitalism has been the subject of much debate. For some, it represents a unique form of capitalism, known as Sino-capitalism, in which there is a synergetic dynamic between central plans, top-down plans, and local unscripted initiatives which have interacted to produce impressive economic results. For others, China has much in common with other East Asian countries and is best seen as part of an East Asian developmental capitalism, capable of harnessing the guiding powers of a competent state with the workings of the market. For others still, China can best be described as constituting a form of state capitalism, thereby placing it in a broader group of countries as diverse as Venezuela and Egypt, in which the state plays a significant role in the ownership and direction of the economy, with the ever-present threat of predatory behaviour by state elites and managers. So even if it is accepted that China has undergone a systemic transition to capitalism, it is still open to debate whether the resulting variety is best understood as a form of capitalism unique to China, one which has a specific regional characteristic, or as one which finds more general expression in many countries around the world. The third transition which I wish to identify here is the green transition, or the energy transition, or the transition to a low or post-carbon economy. It's variously named. With its historic reliance on coal-fueled industrialization, this obviously poses a major challenge for China, as indeed it does for many others. China's response has also been like others, including Canada, I might note, in the sense that it has increased fossil fuel production at the same time as seeking to replace it and reduce carbon emissions. In China, this transition has meant supporting and facilitating the growth and adoption of new green energy products, such as solar panels, wind turbines, hydrogen fuel, carbon capture technology, and electric vehicles. Obviously, China's ability to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions is a matter of concern for Chinese residents, but is also for those of the rest of the world too. It's been argued, a bit tongue-in-cheek, that the fate of the world depends on what less than 1% of the voters in Pennsylvania think about their grocery bills, as this may determine the outcome of the US election. This makes a good headline, but an equally good one would be that the fate of the world also depends on decisions made by a few enterprise managers and economic officials in China's energy sector. All three of these transitions, development, systemic, green, are essentially uncharted. Britain was the first industrializing country. Late industrializers in Western Europe and the United States came in the 19th century, and the late industrializers of the second half of the 20th century, such as South Korea and Singapore, are considerably smaller countries population-wise than China, and are also few in number. So there's very limited, if any, experience of a large country like China making the development transition into ranks of high-income countries in the recent past. No state has attempted the scale of the systemic transition in the controlled and gradual way that China has, and no state has yet to make the green transition, although many are at least paying lip service to trying. Managing any one of these transitions is a huge challenge. Managing all three simultaneously is truly daunting. I would argue that the Chinese authorities do not know how the various transitions will unfold, even though they have their preferences and have some tools to achieve them. But there are also complexities and contradictions in managing all three, even without the inevitable but unpredictable interventions of external events. For example, some argue that China's model of state capitalism enables it to speed up the green transition by channeling resources into sustainable industries, technologies, and activities which might otherwise be slow to develop. This is essentially the basis for the Western tariffs imposed on China's electric vehicle exports, that the Chinese state unfairly subsidizes the EV industry. Others have argued that China's system of state capitalism makes greenhouse gas emissions and environmental pollution more difficult to reduce. This is because state-owned enterprises are seen as not being responsive to profit or cost-reducing incentives and are therefore partially removed from market pressures to reduce emissions and pollution. The development transition, with its emphasis on economic growth, may conflict with efforts to move to more sustainable production, i.e. environmental protection will be sacrificed for growth or job protection when push comes to shove. And the lack of clarity over the scope and limits of systemic reform, remember Deng Xiaoping's famous dictum that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it captures the mouse, i.e. it doesn't matter whether a form of ownership is capitalist or socialist as long as there's growth, who cares? This means that the development transition, as defined in conventional economic terms, takes precedence over social dimensions that a broader understanding of development would entail. There is little space for reconsideration of the goals of economy and society, the definition of what is a good society, including whether North American-style consumption should be the goal, or what forms of ownership or work relations might produce the most desirable social outcomes. I've spent some time outlining these three transitions to underscore a major point, namely that China is undergoing multiple transitions, none of which have well-defined paths or outcomes. This poses problems for China's officials, but also for other countries which interact economically and politically with China in significant ways, which is to say, just about all countries. To go behind the policy headlines, the framework that I have suggested points to 4 possible ways of assessing policy interactions and responses of other states. These can be described as transition supporting, transition neutral, transition shifting, and transition blocking. It is these last 2 types of policy interactions that result in tensions and conflicts with China, and so I will talk a little bit about them further. As an example, the WTO classification of China as a non-market economy, which I mentioned earlier, can be seen as a transition shifting policy. It is intended to push China towards further liberalization of its economy and to alter the path of its systemic transition so that it more closely resembles a liberal market variety of capitalism. The US decision to force the sale of TikTok in the US can also be interpreted in this way. And these, of course, have led to considerable frictions between China and the US. Even greater sources of friction have come from recent US policies, which can be seen as transition blocking responses. The perceived threat to US global supremacy by China's development transition has led to the adoption of policies which essentially seek to block that transition. The ban on high-tech exports to China and the ban on Huawei are examples of policies which can be interpreted in this way. This type of geo-economic rivalry inevitably leads to major tensions between the world's two largest economies. Some policy responses may have, intentionally or not, several different implications. For example, the tariff on China's EV exports is an attempt to influence the systemic transition by moving China away from heavy state involvement, but may also threaten to block the development transition by penalising new high-tech manufacturing industry. It may also impact the green transition globally if it results in fewer EVs being sold and used. This analysis has implications for Canadian policymakers. The first is simply how far it wishes to align itself with US transition blocking policies. With US policy towards China unlikely to change much whoever wins the November election, countries like Canada must choose how far to go in matching US policies. But the second dimension of this concerns Canada's own policies. For example, there's a big push in my home province of BC to sell liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Canada and other Asian countries. The largest single private investment in Canadian history is about to be completed with the LNG Canada export terminal in Kitimat due to start shipments next year. The project is being promoted as supporting the global energy transition and transition supporting for China as it can replace coal with lower carbon LNG. So the argument that's being used is that the LNG exports increase natural gas and reduce coal. Others have argued that it will not necessarily replace coal. What it might do is slow the development of renewables, so that instead of this part being reduced, this part will be slowed. So there is debate about whether Canada's LNG exports is transition supporting or not for China. But even if it is decided that it is transition supporting, it does not necessarily mean that it's good policy for Canada. Why not, you may ask? This is because Canada is undergoing its own transitions, including the transition to a post-settler colonial state through implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and UNDRIP. However, the pipeline, which takes natural gas to the terminal in Kitimat, runs through unceded Indigenous territories. And you may recall that the country was brought to a standstill in February 2022 when rail lines, and that picture is from Winnipeg, rail lines, including in Winnipeg and ports, were blocked in support of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs' opposition to the pipeline being constructed without their consent. So an LNG export policy, which might appear as transition supporting for Canada, might be seen differently in a different context as transition blocking for Canada. So my argument can be summarised as follows. To go behind the headlines, it is useful to understand China's multiple transitions. These are ongoing and uncharted, and many twists and turns can be expected. Tensions will rise with China and more headlines will be generated if and when countries adopt transition blocking and policy responses. Countries like Canada need to independently assess its own transition policy responses. And in doing so, it's not only China's transitions that must be understood, but also Canada's own transitions. My suggestion is that understanding and analysing the complex dynamics of transitions can aid us in identifying medium-term policies, to consider trade-offs strategically, and to provide more foresight on policy implications. In short, to avoid short-term policy scrambling, which produce froth but do not necessarily help us navigate through the waves beneath. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for that very, very interesting talk. So we do have a microphone that will make its way around for any of you who have questions, but they've allowed me to sit up at the front here with the microphone first. So that means I get to ask the first question. And I think I just want to pick up a point from where you kind of finished and taking our attention back to questions of settler colonialism, what are the transitions in Canada that we're committed to, or that, I don't know who the we in there was, but that we would like to think either leadership or individuals or communities are committed to. And is that taking us back around to the first kind of, I guess, tension or separation that you noted between an economistic interpretation, and you noted right from the beginning that there's, kind of an ongoing sense of where does human development, where does that sit in with our measures and our understanding? And is that kind of where we're coming back around to once we start thinking about what's the, not just the damage to the land and thinking about green, but the kind of very way in which they get separated out into separate transitions. So I guess I'm just inviting you to think, because back through this, so how do we get the human development back in there, and how do we hold the different transitions in relation to each other? Because it seems that separating out is what makes it harder to sort of, see what's going in which way, and how that would be part of a longer or medium term, I guess in your words, policy solutions. I think it's on.
Okay. I wish I could thank you for the question. So if we break that down into several parts, the first one was, what are Canada's transitions? Well, I'm sure everyone in the room has a view of what they are or should be. We can probably all agree on two of them, which would be addressing climate change. So the climate transition to a low or post-carbon economy would be one. And the second one would be around reconciliation within Indigenous peoples. So I think both of those implicitly, I think, and explicitly recognize the human dimension, as you've called it, and point to alternative ways of thinking about well-being. Those are important and fundamental to the way in which we should analyse transitions and the way in which they are being analysed in Canada. But I also think that one cannot ignore economistic interpretations, particularly for countries who are not at the same level of per capita GDP and for whom increasing per capita GDP still remains an aspiration. So how do they all fit together, and why would one separate them out? Well, I think why do we categorize things? We hope that by doing so, it gives us insights into separating out complex processes, which, although they're all intertwined, they're all entangled. Nevertheless, if we make some distinctions and try and differentiate between different transitions, then by analysing any one, we might be able to gain more insight than by saying, oh, look, everything is interconnected, everything is going on. How are we going to get a handle on this? Analytically, we categorize things, but as I think your question indicates, the danger of doing that is that in separating things out for greater clarity, you miss those interactions and leads you down dead ends. So I take the point, but I think analytically it's still important, or it can still be useful to think in those different terms and to see where those interactions can conflict.
Great. I think we will bring the microphone around, but I'm going to ask one question while people are putting their hands up so you can decide where to take this. And this actually takes you to a smaller point in the discussion, but really about this transition around ownership and knowing that you've done a lot of work thinking about sort of, what's happening in rural spaces in China. So not really part of your talk, but asking you to think in other ways. And I guess as you were talking about the transition to green and low carbon, I was thinking about probably, I want to say it was about 8 years ago, maybe longer, when I was in China and doing some work in rural spaces. I work in film projection and things like that. And there, many of the slogans around building in the rural cooperatives, which are development enterprises, so collectively owned, but they had, everywhere we went, there were new slogans of build a green society. And it was something that became the standing joke amongst me and my team, and my children were young who were there as well, because it was the idea that you would basically, completely raise the ground and then you would build something green on top of it rather than, begin with what was already there. And so I always sit and I think through these ways in which I think you're talking about. There's these different transitions. So what's the steps that you take? But I wonder for the audience, if you could just talk through a little bit more when you were talking about that transition in ownership, like how does rural ownership work? Because it's a really complex place, and I think it's somewhere where we often get caught up when we're looking from China from outside, where we go, well, is it, who's owning it? Is it collectively owned? Is it the state? And what's the relationship to development? So I thought I'd just invite you to talk a little bit through that.
Yes. So the work that I did in looking at rural ownership was done with my colleague who's in the audience today, Professor Dong from the University of Winnipeg, who knows infinitely more about this than I do. So please ask her in the reception afterwards for the correct answer. So I mean, we didn't look specifically at who owns rural land, because it is a lifetime question on its own about how it's, how is it allocated between households, who gets the right to use it, for how long, under what conditions, when is it confiscated for industrial projects. I'm just going to say it's a very complicated question on which there are volumes written. I'm not an expert on it, so I can't answer exactly how is rural land owned. But there was an interesting debate during COVID, because many migrant workers, their jobs in the export sector disappeared, and they went back to the countryside to access land and income there. And so there was this sort of this contestation around the returning migrants. What rights do they have to land? Is it just through household members who are still there? Do they have rights other than that? Are there any reallocations that can go on? Does this form? Is it useful as a way of enabling capitalist enterprises to release labor when it needs to, and therefore serves a useful function for capitalist accumulation and development? Or is it a sign that there is still socialist ownership in the countryside? So that debate played out too, and it's an ongoing discussion.
Well, I think you point us to the kind of those different types of transitions. And I think, for many of us who've studied China for a long time, the household registration system, the hukou system, many people saw the dismantling of that as a key part to economic progress, to thinking about, and in COVID, the lack of registration and links to people for access to services really came to the forefront, and the question of how that was kind of surveying even, these moments when the economy had a distinct turn. And so I think you really brought us right into one of those examples where the transition is really unknown which way it will go. So I think the microphone is out, and go ahead, Robert. First question.
I wonder if you speculate about the possibility or the chances of China making that stage, that next level of stage, which would require research and development levels. And so obviously it's part of its economistic how much resources are going to be poured into it. But to what extent are they going to be able to move from buying advanced technology and reverse engineering to developing their own? That's partly a cultural, educational aspect, in addition to the usual financing. Authoritarian states sometimes have a tendency to trouble doing that. And that would seem to be pretty critical for them to be able to make that next move into that more advanced stage of high value-added production.
Yeah, thanks. Certainly one can say that the intention is there and that the plan is there, and to spend more on science and technology to promote innovation. These are all identified as national goals with financing behind it. Whether China will get there, I don't know what time frame you have in mind. The goal that they've set themselves is middle income status by 2035, which probably doesn't. So just to give that some context, that would mean annual growth rates for the next 15 years of roughly 4.5%, and it would mean doubling the size of the Chinese economy from today to 15 years' time. So that's double the amount of output. Of course, if it can be done more efficiently, that doesn't mean doubling the amount of inputs, but it still means a huge amount of resources being used. And it's very hard to know that question, the answer to that question. If you read something like the Financial Times, you'll find they continue to say, oh, China's dominant in this sector, it's dominant in that sector, it's now dominant in piano making, it's dominant in white goods. China's the dominant exporter, which it is in many of those sectors. And so it indicates that there is, huge gains that have been made, and that underscores that explains in part the GDP per capita increases which you see. But moving to the technological frontier is one thing, and pushing it out further, which is the sort of development you're talking about, is a much harder step, and few countries have been able to do that. But if I was, I'm going to answer the question by giving you an answer, say, in 50 years' time, so it's not going to matter to me whether I'm right or wrong. So in 50 years' time, my guess is China will be quite a long way along that path.
The Americans are blocking it on the assumption that they won't be making the transition very soon. They're blocking the transition to advanced technology.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? There's one down here in the front, in the second row.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for such a thought-provoking lecture. I really appreciate it. And my question is about Russia and China, and in the context of the war in Ukraine. And China has become a vital partner for Russia, as Russia, we all know, seeks to soften the impact of sanctions from the US and other countries in Europe. And so today about 70% of machine tools and 80% of the microelectronics Russia inputs come from China. So my question is, what are your reflections about this, and what symptoms do we see here, and what actually, using your metaphor of transition, where actually this transition is heading to? Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking that and for raising that question. It's one on which I have no expertise to answer it. This is connected to the global transition that I was identified earlier towards multipolarity, and how the world is being reshaped by emerging countries and old countries and by war. I don't know enough about Chinese foreign policy to be able to tell you where China will go with that, how far it's willing to underwrite the Russian war effort, or whether it's more circumspect in that. I just don't know. I'm sorry. But thank you for raising it, but I can't give you a good answer. Maybe someone in the audience knows.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another question up right in the middle, and then we'll come right back down to the front after as well.
Thank you. Hi, Professor. I've been thinking about how, I guess, from the beginning of anthropology, we've had to struggle, with the concept of Eurocentricism, and I guess in this context, Anglo-American centricism, which of course is not the same as ethnocentricism. But I think we're seeing, even just in spite of decades of that, just this month now, we're seeing where our national federal government is cutting the number of international student permits that will be allowed, as well as the amount of work they can do here in Canada, which seems so basic. If you're an intelligent, bright person, why wouldn't you want to work? But so it seems like even now, even our supposedly liberal, progressive national government is once again raising that boogeyman of the fear of the foreigner and the other, and why, if you were able to give advice, for instance, to Canadians, what would you say in terms of how we present ourselves and what are we doing for the challenges and meeting the international stage and the global village?
I think that the first piece of advice I would have is there are always short-run issues that come up. So to use the example that you gave around international students, so that's part of the bigger story around migration. And Canada was had until very recently been something of an outlier in Europe and the United States in having quite large targets for immigration, whereas we know to the country to the south and in the EU and in the UK, there's much less. There was what the former British Prime Minister Theresa May called the creation of a hostile environment for immigrants, and often a distinction is made between legal and illegal and whatever. But the basic thrust is that my impression is that Canada was something of an outlier and had a relatively liberal immigration policy and saw immigrants coming to Canada as a way to boost economic growth through their contributions to the economy. They also, by mentioning international students, kept many universities afloat, and they're now struggling with the consequences of that reversal. And that reversal seems to have come about essentially because of concerns over housing affordability. That having 500,000 new migrants come to Canada each year, but the housing stock not increasing by much, causes increased pressures on housing and worsen the housing affordability problem. So I think that the Canadian discussion around immigration has been a little different than that elsewhere. And I think the problems have been just reactions to short-term political problems without having a thought-through medium-term strategy.
I think there's a question. Yeah, right there. Thanks.
In your discussion of the green transition in China, you sort of said in passing that other countries that are undergoing the same transition, it might be a matter of lip service rather than factual transition. Where would China fit in there? Is it a degree of lip service there as well?
Thank you. Another good question, another very broad question. There are, and it's a complex question, which is why I'm taking my time before I put my foot right in it. So, if you look at some indicators, so. China has a lot of the world's rare earth resources. And it has very carefully set production targets for those and very carefully prevented the export of too many of those. Because it wants to use those rare earth materials for its own transition to non-fossil fuel energy sources. It has, in other critical minerals, it doesn't have such large deposits itself, but it has set up much of the world's refining and processing capacity. So it imports lots of lithium, it imports lots of cobalt, and uses those materials for battery production. So a lot of the demands for electricity and electricity generation are very high. A lot of that is now coal-based. I saw a figure the other day from the International Energy Association saying that roughly 50% of the coal which is burned today in the world is burned by China. So they want to find ways of storing electricity through batteries, and so have made a big investment in electric batteries and electric vehicles, etc. So on that level, then you can certainly say that there has been a very definite plan which has been implemented. I mean, just anecdotally, I can say that I did some research in Nanjing, and you take a taxi, and one year I went there, and all the taxis had been converted to electric vehicles. So there is this. So on some measures, there is clearly a big push for a green transition, and China, I think, is responsible for roughly 80% of the world's solar panels being produced, and you see them on top of all buildings, apartment buildings. So it's a green transition in support of industrialization and growing per capita incomes further. So in that sense, I think that there is a very definite commitment to that form of energy transition, but it still remains the case that China has huge numbers of coal mines. Large coal production is still increasing the fossil fuel output. It wishes to have peak carbon emissions before 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2060. That's a huge goal, which I can't imagine that it would be possible to meet. So on that sort of range of green initiatives, you can definitely see them there. In terms of more of the sorts of things that Tina was talking about earlier, what about, one could argue, and I think quite reasonably, that we're not going to have a genuine green transition without having more energy democracy, grassroots democracy over control of how resources are used and why they're being used. And as long as they're still in the hands of large corporations, it may be difficult to get that transition. Now, there's no sign of any sort of transition in that sense of a green transition in China at all. So I think it is a very specific form of green transition which is being pursued.
I think we have another question up. Oh, and Heidi as well. And then up in 1, 2. I think maybe we'll gather the questions perhaps just in the interest of time. And so that, you can answer them and kind of sort through them. But so Heidi, one up in here and one down here. We'll make sure we get all this. Oh, and another one there. So we've got 4 questions that we're going to gather. And then, and I'm happy to take my mic up as well, perhaps. And then you can do the ones on that side. But go ahead, Heidi.
Thank you, Paul. This is a different kind of question. Knowing that we have a lot of students in the room who are potential future scholars, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you chart uncharted transitions as a scholar. And by that, I mean, what is your approach to the data that you gather? How do you do that work? And then also, what kinds of conversations are you in as a scholar that what about your presentation today might your fellow scholars find controversial? And what kind of conversation are you having in that forum with other scholars of the same kind of topics?
We're going to gather the questions, so go ahead.
And then my question would be for the younger and less experienced of us in the crowd today, looking to broaden our horizons about China's economic development and business between Chinese and American students and people and getting into business. How would we broaden our horizons? What would you recommend as materials to broaden our understanding?
I think we'll gather 2's good, and then we'll come back up for the next 2. I'm looking over at the person who's keeping time.
Okay, thanks for the questions, which are in some ways related about how do we as scholars or as students interact and find out more about China, and I'll just on the scholarly question. I did a project a few years ago with a provincial academy of social science. So there's the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a national body, and beneath that each of the provinces has a provincial academy of social sciences. And I was involved in a project with a group there, and we had funding from IDRC, International Development Research Centre, Canadian funded body. And when we went there, the Chinese scholar with the provincial academy had come to my university under a Chinese scholarship provided by the state to come for a year to do a research project about Canada, to learn about Canada. He came, and on the basis of that, we developed a project back in China, which he was very keen about. And we went to China in the first year of the 3-year project. And it was all fabulous. We met with deans and vice provosts and all the important people, and we're hosted by them, and we had a very good working relationship. By the end of the 3-year project, when we came to publish our results, we said, well, let's write this up and together. And he was very clear. He said, we don't want our names on that report or anywhere on any publications, because the political winds have shifted. Now, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when we were applying for the money and we got the money, researching with foreigners outside of China was seen very positively and supported. Now it's not. Now there are various cases that you may have heard of where state secrets being leaked to foreign scholars, etc. And so I thought at the time, it must be so hard to operate in a system like that where the political winds shift so quickly, and 1 minute you're welcome and 1 minute you're not, and I'm glad I'm in good old boring Canada where nothing like that happens. And lo and behold, what happens suddenly, out of nowhere, suddenly to do work in China has become very controversial, where provincial governments, federal governments have started looking at universities saying, what are your links with China? What data are you giving them? So it was just the same thing in reverse. So it's become quite difficult. So I would say that the main discussions I have with other people doing research in China now is how difficult it is, and how the shifting political currents in both countries have made doing research different. In terms of how could students broaden their horizons, what resources should they look at, what should they use? I would say read as widely as possible. I would have said that no matter what the question, actually, but that's a sort of standard professorial answer: is read as widely as possible. Read the news media, and go to your international office where there are scholarships available for students to go on exchanges to countries, and see if you can take advantage of one of those, because that will be an experience that will hold you in good stead for a long time. So read and go there.
And I'm just going to add to there, because it seems the right place to put the plug in for the Asian Studies Department here, Center in Language. But I think that's where, and those of us who we would think of we sometimes get categorized on these language of like old China hands or people who've done them. But I think, one thing that I'm very interested in talking to students now is the idea that the ways in which we learn languages are different, or what we might need to go and travel. And I would say, no matter how good translation software gets, how much it facilitates that it's, that still the ability to function and sort of listen to, and I think it even goes back to the earlier questions, to move outside of our own idea of being centered, and so that people need to be translated into what we understand, but pushing ourselves to understand in the language, in the logics. You talked about the logics of, kind of economistic framework, right? If we're not thinking through the language and the frameworks that others are, it's really hard to understand what's happening. So I would also say take some time to learn language, something you can also do with the scholarships offered. So we'll go there. I think there was one question over here, and I think one other one. I can't see where the hand went now, but we'll take those final questions. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Doctor. That was really in depth, more than I thought. My question is more leaning towards the climate. I'm going to use the words global north and global south. So global north is the wealthy countries up here. Global south is the developing countries. Do you feel like these two factions in the world are talking past each other when it comes to climate? I'm recalling a speech that Indira Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister, gave. I actually prepared this beforehand. And what she said was that the rich countries look disapprovingly at us in the global south because of our poverty, but they also berate us for wanting to use their own methods they use to develop. We have the largest populations in the world. are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? And I'm wondering, how relevant do you think her words are still today?
Was there another question, or I don't see another hand, so I think you get to close on that question.
Okay, so thanks for your question, and thanks for the quote. It's a good one. I was taking notes. I mean, officially, the language of international climate agreements are around common and differentiated responses. So, in other words, it should be a common aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but differentiated, meaning that the global north should do more faster than the global south, so that the global south can continue on its what I call development transition. In other words, that the development transition is not closed off because of climate action. Now, one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to get agreement on that, firstly, there's a problem of how to get agreement. Secondly, there's implementing it and then having action on it. So one of the reasons it's been so difficult is because the stock of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere has been caused by the global north. But most of the new emissions come from the global south, especially China. So you have a stock and flow problem here. And what sort of reparations what would climate justice look like? What reparations should the global north pay to the global south for the fact that it has taken up the global carbon budget? And how can that be sorted out? So I see very little. I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic. I see little evidence that sort of discussion is happening in any serious way about. So I would agree with the quote that you gave. But that's a rather pessimistic note on which to end, isn't it?
Well, I'm going to hope that Roisin Kossar is going to close us out, and I'm hoping that she can maybe take it up a note from that rather pessimistic one with the promises of a reception. Roisin.
Thanks, Tina. Hi, everybody. I am Roisin Kossar. I'm the head of the Department of History here at U of M. And it's really my pleasure to thank Dr. Bowles very much for a very stimulating talk. And I think we can see, the range of questions and interests that have been stimulated this afternoon. Is a really good indication of that. And I have a small token of appreciation from the Faculty of Arts in thanks for everything that you've done this afternoon. And and we'll do the requisite picture. Tina's going to get out of the way. There we are. Lovely. Thank you so much. And as well, of course, I want to thank again Tony Lau, whose generous donation has made this the third annual lecture possible. And again, Tony, thank you so much for your support, your tireless support, both for the Faculty of Arts and particularly for the students of the Faculty of Arts. Very, very important to all of us. And finally, yes, well, please join me. And finally, as Tina says, there's a reception just outside here in the lobby. Please stay for a few minutes, have a chance to ask Dr. Bowles some more difficult questions, and of course, meet Tony as well, and have a chance to talk all together. Thank you all for coming.